The air in the Mobile Strategic Command Center was thick with the scent of ozone, stale coffee, and fear. It was a pressurized, windowless cylinder of steel buried 300 feet beneath the Nevada desert, a place designed to survive the apocalypse and direct the response. Tonight, it felt more like a tomb in waiting. Arrays of holographic displays painted the faces of the uniformed men and women in flickering shades of crimson and amber. Threat vectors bloomed like cancerous flowers over a map of the globe. General Marcus Vance stood at the center of the chaos, a titan carved from granite and impatience. His 4 stars glittered on the collar of his immaculate service uniform, a stark contrast to the sweat beading on his brow. His voice, a gravelly force of nature accustomed to shaking subordinates to their core, boomed across the command deck. I want a goddamn solution, not another problem. Kendrick, where is our comms redundancy? Where is the satellite handshake? Major Kendrick, a man whose face was a permanent mask of strained competence, flinched. Sir, the initial cyber attack was a feint. The real payload wasn't a virus. It was a logic bomb targeted at the root firmware of our entire network architecture. We're not just offline. The system is actively fighting us. It's rewriting its own protocols. Then unwrite them. Vance roared, his fist slamming down on the central console, making a junior airman jump. It was into this maelstrom that Dr. Eris Thorne entered. She moved with a quiet, unobtrusive grace that was utterly at odds with the frantic energy of the room. She wore simple gray slacks and a charcoal blouse, civilian attire that made her look like a lost accountant who had stumbled into Armageddon. Her hair, a mix of brown and silver, was pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was lined with a history that no one in the room knew how to read. Her gaze calm and analytical as she took in the controlled panic. She carried a simple, worn leather satchel. Her arrival was noted with a series of dismissive glances. A technician near the entrance, a young man named Specialist Ocampo, nudged his partner. Pentagon must be sending grief counselors early, he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Eris ignored him, her eyes scanning the cascading lines of corrupt code on the main screen. She saw not chaos, but a pattern, a signature. Her steps were measured as she moved toward the central command hub, her path taking her directly into the orbit of the furious general. Lieutenant Evans, a young officer with a jawline sharper than his strategic acumen, stepped forward to intercept her. He puffed out his chest, a reflexive gesture of authority. Ma'am, this is a restricted area. I'm going to have to ask you to return to the briefing room. She didn't break her stride. Her eyes remained fixed on the screens. I'm where I need to be, Lieutenant. Her voice was low, devoid of challenge, yet it held an unnerving finality. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the din. Evans was momentarily taken aback. Before he could reassert himself, she had passed him, her satchel brushing his perfectly pressed sleeve. She stopped a few feet from General Vance, placing her bag on an empty console chair. Vance finally noticed her. He turned, his entire posture radiating disbelief and incandescent rage. He saw a middle-aged woman in civilian clothes, a bureaucratic ghost in his war machine. Who in the hell are you? He demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Dr. Eris Thorne, she said, her tone level. She began unzipping her satchel. I was sent by the Office of Emergency Protocol. Vance let out a short, incredulous laugh that was more of a bark. Emergency protocol? Lady, we are 30 seconds from a global strategic breakdown and you're talking about protocols? Did they send you here to take notes? To fill out a goddamn after-action report on the end of the world? He gestured wildly at the room. Look around you, Doctor. This is not a seminar. This is the precipice. Whatever paper-pushing nonsense you were sent to do can wait. Get her out of here, Evans. The dismissal was absolute, a hammer blow of condescension. He had already turned his back on her, focusing again on the failing systems as if she had ceased to exist. Evans moved to take her arm, his expression a mixture of apology and annoyance. Ma'am, you heard the general. We really don't have time for... Eris didn't look at him. She pulled a slim, hardened data slate from her bag, its casing scarred and pitted from use. She powered it on, its screen glowing with a simple text-based interface that looked decades out of date. "General Vance," she said, her voice cutting through his renewed tirade at Major Kendrick. "Your counter-intrusion software is accelerating the lockdown. You're trying to fight a forest fire with a squirt gun, and the fire is feeding on the water." Vance spun around, his face turning a shade of purple. The sheer audacity of her statement, of her presence, was a personal affront. "Are you a systems analyst, Doctor?" He spat, the word doctor dripping with sarcasm. "Of a sort," she replied, her fingers already tapping across the slate screen. "I have the best military cyber warfare specialists in the world in this room," Vance bellowed, his voice echoing in the sudden, tense silence that had fallen over the command deck. Everyone was watching now. "I have men and women from MIT, from DARPA. And you, a civilian who looks like she should be cataloging books in the Library of Congress, are going to tell us how to do our jobs." Major Kendrick stepped forward, attempting to de-escalate. "Sir, perhaps the doctor has a different perspective. A fresh set of eyes." Vance waved him off dismissively. "A fresh set of eyes? We're facing a decapitation strike, Major. Our nuclear arsenal is being blinded, our command structure severed. The enemy has burrowed into our core systems. And you want me to listen to a bureaucrat? To someone whose clearance probably took an act of Congress to get her into this room? I don't have time for perspectives. I need solutions." And he pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Eris, "is not a solution. She is a distraction." The collective gaze of the room fell upon Eris. It was heavy, judgmental. They saw what the general saw, an outsider, an unknown variable in an equation that was already unsolvable. The young technicians who had mocked her now watched with a kind of pitying contempt. They were trained for this. They lived and breathed this technology. She was an academic, a theorist. She didn't belong here in the engine room with grease on her hands. Eris met the general's furious glare without flinching. Her expression remained placid, her focus absolute. She wasn't looking at him, but through him, at the problem that lay behind him, displayed in dying light on the holographic screens. "Your specialists are excellent soldiers, General," she said, her voice calm and even. "They are fighting the enemy they were trained to fight. But this isn't a soldier. This is a ghost. It doesn't follow the rules of engagement. And you know the rules?" Evans scoffed from the side, emboldened by the general's hostility. "What's your area of expertise, Doctor?" "Post-structuralist interpretations of conflict." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the nearby staff. The tension was so thick that any release, however cruel, was welcome. Eris's fingers never stopped moving over her data slate. She was connecting it to the console using a coiled, heavy-duty cable she produced from her satchel. The port she chose was an auxiliary diagnostic port, one rarely used, covered by a small, bolted plate. She had to use a small, multi-headed driver from her bag to remove it. The act was methodical, precise, and utterly infuriating to the general. It was as if she were in her own world, a quiet workshop, deaf to the impending doom and his authority. "Get your hands off my console," Vance ordered, his voice dangerously low. "That is a direct order. I don't know who you are or what little fiefdom you crawled out of, but in this room, I am the supreme authority. You will stand down, step away, and await my convenience. Is that understood?" For the first time, she paused. She looked up from her work, her gray eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them, no defiance, only a profound, weary stillness. "The system is entering its final cascade, General. In approximately 90 seconds, a terminal failsafe will engage. It's not a shutdown. It's a self-destruct sequence for the facility's entire data core. A hardware-level purge. It will flash-melt every server, every drive, every chip in this mountain. The resulting EMP will fry every unshielded piece of electronics for 50 miles. Your command and control won't just be blind. It will be lobotomized. Permanently." A cold dread washed over the room, thicker than the previous panic. Kendrick's face went pale. "She's right, sir. I'm seeing the precursor flags now. It's a scorched earth protocol. We never thought. We thought it was a theoretical failsafe. And I am telling you," Eris said, turning back to her slate, "that I am the only person in this room who can stop it." Vance's face was a mask of thunderous fury. He saw her not as a savior, but as the final, absurd insult in a night of catastrophic failures. His authority, his control, his entire world was crumbling, and this woman was ignoring a direct order from a 4-star general. It was unthinkable. It was anarchy. "That's it," he snarled, stepping forward. He was about to physically remove her when a new alarm, a piercing, gut-wrenching siren, began to scream. On the main screen, a new symbol appeared. A stark, white countdown clock. 1:29, 1:28, 1:27. The crisis had arrived. The theoretical had become terrifyingly real. The low hum of the facility's power systems began to change, rising in pitch to a whining metallic keen. The lights, which had been flickering, now dimmed to a hellish, emergency red. The holographic displays dissolved into static, replaced by the single, stark image of the countdown clock, now projected on every available surface. It was a digital guillotine falling. "Report," Vance bellowed, his voice strained against the rising shriek of the alarms. "It's the main reactor bus," Kendrick shouted over the noise, his hands flying over a dead keyboard out of sheer instinct. "The failsafe is drawing power directly from the geothermal core. It's bypassing all regulatory systems. Sir, we can't shut it down. It's locked us out at the hardware level." Panic, raw and uncontained, finally broke through the military discipline. A young analyst tore off his headset and stared, wide-eyed, at the clock. Specialist Ocampo, the one who had mocked Eris, was frozen, his face ashen. These were the best and brightest, trained for every conceivable scenario, and they were utterly, completely helpless. Their tools had been taken from them. Their kingdom of logic and order had been overthrown by a phantom they couldn't fight. The general, for all his bluster, was equally powerless. He stared at the countdown, his authority rendered meaningless. He was just a man in a uniform, trapped in a box, waiting for the end. The carefully constructed edifice of his command was collapsing into primal fear. He was a general with no army, a king with no subjects, only fellow prisoners. Amidst the escalating chaos, Eris Thorne was an island of impossible calm. The alarms, the shouting, the palpable terror in the air seemed to wash over her without effect. Her focus was absolute, narrowed to the small screen of her data slate and the lines of code scrolling across it. Her breathing was even, her hands steady. She was not panicking. She was working. She bypassed the main interface, which was now a brick wall of corrupted security protocols. Her slate was not attacking the system. It was talking to it, whispering to it in a forgotten native language. She was accessing the machine's BIOS, the primal brainstem that existed beneath the layers of sophisticated software the enemy had compromised. The code she wrote was elegant, sparse, a series of commands that looked more like poetry than programming. 1:01, 1:00, 0:59. "It's not working," Evans yelled, his voice cracking. "Whatever you're doing, it's not working." Eris ignored him. She was watching the system's feedback. She saw the ghost in the machine fighting back, closing doors as fast as she could open them. It was intelligent, reactive. It had anticipated this kind of approach. It was a fortress, but every fortress has a secret passage. She disconnected her slate from the diagnostic port. The gesture seemed like a surrender, and a collective groan of despair went through the room. Vance looked at her with pure hatred. "You failed," he hissed, the words lost in the siren's wail. But she wasn't finished. She moved to the main server rack that formed the back wall of the command deck, a monolithic slab of humming metal and blinking lights. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hand on a specific panel, feeling the vibrations, the heat. Then, She reached into her satchel and pulled out not a piece of technology, but a simple, heavy-duty pry bar. With a sharp, efficient movement, she jammed the tip into the seam of the panel and leveraged it open. Metal screamed in protest. Sparks showered the floor. It was a brutal, physical act in a world of digital elegance. "What are you doing?" Kendrick shrieked, horrified. "You'll destabilize the core magnetic containment." Eris didn't answer. She pulled the warped panel away, revealing a dense nest of fiber-optic cables and coolant pipes. The air that washed out was frigid, smelling of ozone and ionized particles. Her eyes, sharp and practiced, scanned the labyrinthine connections. She was looking for something specific, a single point of failure or of salvation. 0:45, 0:44, 0:43. Her fingers, nimble and sure, dove into the wiring. She wasn't ripping them out. She was rerouting them. She unclipped two thick, glowing blue fiber-optic lines from their sockets and, producing a small, custom-built coupler from her pocket, manually spliced them together. She was performing open-heart surgery on the machine, creating a physical loop, a feedback circuit the system wasn't designed to handle. On the main screen, the countdown clock flickered. For a single, heart-stopping second, it froze at 0:38. A gasp went through the room. Hope, a fragile and almost forgotten thing, sparked in the darkness. But then the system adapted. The ghost fought back. The clock resumed its deadly descent. 0:37, 0:36. The enemy's code was rewriting itself, isolating the physical breach she had created. It was learning. Vance watched, his fury now mixed with a dawning, terrifying realization. This woman knew the anatomy of his facility better than his own engineers. She was not a bureaucrat. She was something else entirely. Eris knew the physical bypass was only a temporary measure, a way to distract the system's primary defenses. While its attention was focused on the hardware breach, she moved back to the main console. She plugged her slate back in. The screen, which had been locked, now showed a single, stark prompt. Terminal override protocol. Authentication required. Beneath it, a cursor blinked. This was the final gate, the heart of the lockdown. It was a level of security that didn't just require a password. It required a key that, as far as anyone in the room knew, was held only by the President of the United States. It was the system's nuclear option, the dead man's switch that could only be disarmed by the highest possible authority. 0:22, 0:21, 0:20. That's a PAL gate, Kendrick whispered in awe, recognizing the protocol. Positive authorization link. It requires a cipher key from the National Command Authority. We're locked out. It's over. Eris's fingers hovered over her slate. She had reached the end of her technical abilities. The machine was now demanding a conversation not with a programmer, but with a god. General Vance saw it too. He saw the authentication prompt and understood its finality. Whatever this woman was, whatever tricks she had, they were useless now. She had brought them to the very last door only to find it locked, the key 1,000 miles away in a briefcase chained to another man's wrist. His rage, which had been momentarily replaced by a sliver of hope, returned with the force of a tidal wave. This was her fault. She had wasted their final, precious seconds on this futile effort. "I gave you an order, Doctor," he roared, his voice cracking with desperation and fury as he strode toward her. The veins on his neck stood out like cords. "I told you to stand down. I told you to get away from my console. You've done nothing. You've brought us to the brink and you have failed." He was right beside her now, his presence overwhelming, his hand reaching for her shoulder to physically drag her away. The countdown was relentless. 0:15, 0:14, 0:13. "Step away from the console," Vance screamed, his face inches from hers. "That is a final, direct order. Security. Get her out of here. Now!" Two heavily armed security officers started to move forward, their weapons raised. The room had shrunk to this single, explosive point of confrontation. The end of the world was ticking down on a screen, and a 4-star general was screaming at a quiet woman in a charcoal blouse. Eris did not flinch. She did not look at the approaching guards. She did not look at her slate. She turned her head slowly, her calm gray eyes meeting the general's blazing, frantic ones. The din of the alarms, the shouting, the terror. It all seemed to fade into a muffled roar, a distant storm. In the small, sudden pocket of silence between them, she spoke. Her voice was not a shout. It was barely a whisper, a soft, confidential murmur meant for him and him alone. Yankee, X-ray, 7, Niner, Kilo, 3, Delta, authentication prime, call sign, continuity. The world stopped. The string of characters was nonsensical to anyone else who might have overheard it. But to General Marcus Vance, it was like a key turning in the deepest, most secret lock of his mind. He had been briefed years ago on protocols so classified they were spoken of only in hypothetical terms. He knew the format. He recognized the cadence. He knew what an authentication prime code was. It was a string that could not be counterfeited, a code that existed outside the normal chain of command, held by a handful of individuals who were, for all intents and purposes, ghosts. They were the designated survivors, the living fail-safes of the nation, empowered to act with absolute authority in the event the government was decapitated. He had never heard a real one spoken aloud. He had never expected to. His eyes widened, the apoplectic rage draining from his face to be replaced by a profound, soul-shaking shock. He stared at her, at this unassuming, middle-aged woman, and saw her for the first time. The simple clothes, the calm demeanor, the scarred data slate. It wasn't weakness or incompetence. It was camouflage. Her call sign, whispered last, was the final blow. Continuity. The word itself was a doctrine. It was the ultimate responsibility. She wasn't just a person with a code. She was the protocol. He froze, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder. The countdown was still screaming its final seconds away. 0:09, 0:08. Eris turned back to the console as if their conversation had been a minor interruption. Her fingers flew across the slate, typing in the code she had just spoken. She added a second, even longer string of characters, one she had not said aloud. The system verification key. On the screen, the prompt blinked once, then accepted the input. Authentication verified. Welcome continuity. Terminal override engaged. With 3 seconds to spare, the countdown clock vanished. The piercing alarm cut off, plunging the room into a stunning, deafening silence. The emergency red lights switched back to standard, sterile white. The holographic displays flickered to life, no longer showing threat vectors, but lines of scrolling green text that read, System purge aborted. Diagnostic mode engaged. Awaiting command. The whining of the reactor bus spooled down, returning to its normal, almost silent hum. For a long moment no one moved, no one breathed. They stood like statues in the sudden, placid quiet, the silence more shocking than the noise had been. They were alive. The world hadn't ended. Then, slowly, General Vance took a step back from Eris. Then another. He looked at his own hand, the one he had been about to use to drag her away, as if it were a foreign object. He looked at the 2 security officers who had frozen mid-stride. His voice, when he finally spoke, was unrecognizable. The booming, arrogant thunder was gone, replaced by a quiet, raw, and utterly humbled rasp. As you were, he said to the guards. They immediately snapped to attention and retreated to their posts, their expressions bewildered. He turned to face the entire command staff. His gaze swept over Kendrick, Evans, and every other stunned face in the room. His authority returned, but it was different now. It was tempered, focused. This woman, he said, his voice clear and absolute in the silence, is continuity. Her authority in this facility, as of this moment, is total and absolute. You will address her as ma'am. You will follow her instructions without question and without hesitation. Her orders supersede my own. They supersede the orders of anyone short of God himself. Is that understood? A ragged chorus of yes, sir echoed through the room. But they weren't looking at him. Every eye was fixed on Eris Thorne. The mockery was gone. The condescension had vanished. Lieutenant Evans looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Major Kendrick stared at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. They were looking at a living myth, a figure from the darkest pages of their contingency plans. She wasn't a bureaucrat. She was the final line of defense, the person they prayed they would never have to meet. Eris, for her part, seemed oblivious to the seismic shift in the room's atmosphere. She was already working, her fingers dancing across the console, not her slate. She was using her authenticated access to hunt. The logic bomb had a secondary payload, she announced, her voice calm and clinical, as if she were dictating a lab report. A data exfiltration worm. It was designed to transmit our entire strategic posture to an encrypted address the moment the primary systems went offline. I've quarantined it, but it's still active. What do you need? Vance asked, his tone now that of a subordinate seeking direction. I need a clean server, completely air-gapped from the network, she said, not looking up. And I need your best analyst, someone who understands signal architecture. The worm is broadcasting a microburst signal. It's too faint to trace with standard equipment. But it's sloppy. It's arrogant. I can use it as a backdoor. Kendrick, Vance commanded instantly. Get her what she needs. Now. Major Kendrick scrambled to comply, his earlier hesitation replaced by a manic efficiency. He guided Eris to a secure analysis station in a quieter corner of the command deck, a place usually reserved for the highest-level intelligence work. He and two of his best technicians worked feverishly under her quiet direction, physically disconnecting a server rack and creating the isolated environment she had requested. For the next 2 hours, Eris worked in a state of pure, focused intensity. She spoke little, issuing short, precise commands. Isolate that frequency band, magnify the signal decay, run a comparative analysis against known satellite constellations. She was no longer just a coder. She was a hunter, a tracker following faint footprints through a digital wilderness. The command deck, once a pit of chaos, was now a model of disciplined silence. The crew worked at their stations, repairing the damage the logic bomb had done, but their movements were quiet, their voices hushed. Every few minutes, their eyes would drift over to the corner where Eris worked, watching her with a reverence usually reserved for a holy relic. General Vance stood near the central console, not speaking, just watching her, his arms crossed over his chest. He was reevaluating everything he thought he knew about power, about authority, about the true nature of the silent wars fought in the shadows. Finally, Eris leaned back from the console. She had cornered her prey. On the screen was a single line of data, a geosynchronous satellite in a high-inclination orbit over the South Pole. It was a civilian communications satellite, or it was supposed to be. There, she said softly. Vance and Kendrick were at her side in an instant. You found the destination? Vance asked. Better, Eris replied. The worm wasn't just sending data. It was receiving it. A constant stream of instructions from that satellite. The attack wasn't automated. It's being actively piloted. She typed a final series of commands. I've reversed the data stream. For the last 20 minutes, everything they thought they were stealing from us was actually a loop of corrupted data I fed them. And everything they've been sending us. She pointed to a file that was rapidly downloading onto her secure server. Is their entire operational playbook. Every command, every query. Their identity. A slow smile touched Kendrick's lips. My God, he breathed. You didn't just stop the attack. You turned their own weapon against them. Eris simply nodded, her work done. She began to pack her data slate and tools back into her worn leather satchel, her movements as deliberate and unhurried as they had been when she arrived. The crisis was over. The ghost had been captured. The sun had not yet risen when Eris Thorne found a quiet, empty corridor branching off the main command deck. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the profound, bone-deep weariness that always followed such an event. She leaned against the cool steel wall, the silence a welcome balm after the sensory assault of the past few hours. She closed her eyes, not in sleep, but in a quiet ritual of centering herself, of letting the role of continuity recede and the woman, Eris, return. The weight of that name, of that responsibility, was immense. It was a cloak she wore, woven from secrets and oaths, and it was heavy. She heard the soft tread of footsteps approaching and opened her eyes. It was General Vance. He was holding two simple, thick ceramic mugs, steam curling from them in the cold air. He looked different. The uniform was the same, but the man inside it seemed diminished, older, and stripped of his earlier arrogance. He looked, she thought, like a man who had stared into the abyss and had been unpleasantly surprised to see it stare back with her eyes. He stopped a few feet away, a respectful distance. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply holding the mugs. "Coffee," he finally said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Black. I didn't know how you took it." "Black is fine," she said, her voice equally soft. He stepped forward and handed one of the mugs to her. Their fingers brushed. His hand was calloused and hard, a soldier's hand. Hers was steady. She wrapped her palms around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her skin. It was a simple, grounding sensation. They stood in silence for a while, sipping the coffee. It was scalding and bitter, exactly what she needed. The formal structure of rank and protocol had dissolved between them, replaced by something more fundamental. A shared experience of a world almost lost. "They never tell you," Vance said, staring down into his mug. "In all the briefings, all the simulations, they never tell you what it will feel like. To have it all come apart. To be completely useless." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers directly. There was no artifice left in them. "I owe you my command. We all owe you our lives." Eris took another sip of coffee. She did not want his gratitude or his apologies. They were unnecessary burdens. "You did your job, General. You held the line until the right tool arrived." His lips twisted into a wry, self-deprecating smile. "The right tool. I screamed at it. I tried to have it thrown out." He shook his head slowly. "How long have you been doing this?" "Long enough," she said. It was the only answer she ever gave to that question. The true answer was measured not in years, but in crises averted, in silent victories that the world would never know. She was one of three people on the entire planet who held the keys. She had been a brilliant systems architect at Sandia Labs, recruited in her late 20s for a program so secret it didn't have a name. She had spent decades in a state of readiness, a quiet life punctuated by moments of absolute, world-ending terror. "The name on your file, Thorne," Vance said. "I thought you might be related to Admiral Thorne. I was going to ask." "No relation," she confirmed. It was a common enough name, a useful coincidence. Another long silence settled between them. In the distance, they could hear the faint, orderly hum of the command center rebooting, of a world being put back together. The sun must be rising now, over the desert, painting the sand in shades of orange and pink. Here, in the belly of the earth, time was measured only by the changing shifts and the quality of the recycled air. Eris finished her coffee. She held the empty mug in her hands, feeling its weight. "The intelligence you recovered will allow you to neutralize the threat," she said, her tone shifting back toward the professional. "My work here is done." Vance nodded slowly. "There will be a debriefing. The president will want to." "There will be no debriefing," Eris interrupted him, her voice gentle but firm. "My report is already filed. As of this moment, I was never here. You and your team averted a hostile cyber attack through conventional means. Your record will reflect that Major Kendrick identified the initial breach and you directed the successful counter-intrusion. This conversation never happened." He understood. Her existence, her very presence, was a state secret of the highest order. To acknowledge her would be to acknowledge a vulnerability, a crack in the armor of the state. She was the ghost. She had to remain one. "I understand," he said. Eris gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. She placed the empty mug on a small ledge recessed into the corridor wall. She turned to leave, her quiet, unobtrusive self once more. "Ma'am," Vance called after her. She paused, her back to him. "Thank you," he said. It was just 2 words, but they were imbued with a depth of respect he had previously reserved for no one. It was the sincere, unvarnished deference of a proud man who had been humbled, of a soldier acknowledging a quiet, greater strength. Eris did not turn around. She did not say, "You're welcome." She simply lifted her hand in a small, acknowledging wave, and then walked away down the sterile corridor, her worn leather satchel in hand, disappearing into the shadows of the machine she had saved. She had a long drive ahead, back to a quiet, anonymous life, where she would wait for the next time the world needed a ghost.